The cold was a living, breathing enemy that night in the Blackwood Forest. It slipped through the rough burlap sack like 1,000 tiny knives, pressing against Vaelinne's skin, stealing the warmth from her blood until every shallow breath felt like shards of ice in her lungs. She couldn't see anything in the absolute darkness, only faint pinpricks of moonlight that did nothing to chase away the terror gripping her throat. Her cousins had tied the knots with cruel efficiency, their laughter still ringing in her ears as they tossed her from the wagon like unwanted refuse. The sound of their horses had long faded into the howling wind, leaving her alone with the creak of frozen branches and the frantic drum of her own heartbeat. This is how I die, she thought, and for one terrifying moment the acceptance felt almost peaceful. Betrayed by her own blood, all for the sake of a family seal and the rich lands it controlled. She had spent her life learning perfect manners, embroidery, and the graceful art of pouring tea, only to end up discarded like kitchen scraps in a winter forest where even the wolves stayed away. Her fingers had gone completely numb hours ago. No matter how hard she tried, they refused to work at the ropes binding the sack. The fine velvet gown her aunt had forced her to wear for a fake journey to meet a non-existent betrothed now clung to her like a frozen shroud. There had never been any betrothal. Only the cold eyes of Cousin Gareth and the false smile of Cousin Merritt as they gagged her and stuffed her into this living tomb. At least it will be quick, she told herself. The dangerous drowsiness of hypothermia was already creeping in, the kind the old servants used to warn about. Sleep in the snow and you never wake. Perhaps that was better than whatever slower end they had planned if she had fought back. Then, through the haze, she heard it, the faint, rhythmic thud of hooves on snow. Multiple horses, moving with disciplined precision, not the chaotic flight of bandits or frightened travelers. Hope flared painfully in her chest, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. She tried to scream, but the frozen rag in her mouth turned her voice into a pathetic wheeze. Her throat was raw, her body too weak. The hoofbeats were passing at an angle that might carry them right by her. No, please, not like this. With the last of her strength, Vaelinne threw her body sideways, ignoring the sharp pain as her shoulder hit something hard beneath the snow. She rolled again and again, the sack dragging across the frozen ground in a desperate, silent prayer. The hoofbeats slowed. She froze, straining to hear past the thunder of her pulse. Had they noticed? A young male voice broke the silence. Sir, there's something off the path. Probably a dead deer. An older voice, heavy with command and bone-deep weariness, replied, Leave it. But the younger man insisted, It moved, sir. A long pause stretched like eternity. Then the commanding voice said simply, Show me. The horses came closer. Vaelinne used every ounce of remaining strength to shift once more, proving she was alive, that she was worth saving. Her vision was dimming, black spots dancing in the darkness, but she refused to slip away now. She heard leather creak as someone dismounted, boots crunching through the snow with measured caution. The footsteps stopped right above her. She could feel the presence, large, solid, radiating heat her frozen body craved. Through the weave of the sack, she made out the vague shape of a broad-shouldered man backlit by moonlight. Gathering every scrap of will left, she forced out two words that emerged as barely a whisper, Help me. The figure went rigid. For one terrible heartbeat she thought she had failed. Then strong hands tore at the ropes. A deep voice like gravel and midnight ordered, Get the healer. Now. When the sack was ripped open, the first thing Vaelinne saw was a pair of eyes the color of winter itself, pale gray, sharp as sword points, and completely unreadable. They belonged to a face carved from granite and shadow, hard angles framed by dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, pale against sun-bronzed skin. His mouth was set in a line that suggested smiling was a forgotten skill. This was Duke Tharion Bellgrave, the Iron Duke of Ironholt, the man whispered about in southern parlors as someone who had killed his first enemy at 12, held the northern passes against invading hordes with nothing but will and steel, and buried his betrothed so deeply he never spoke her name again. She's alive, one of his men said, surprise clear in his voice. Barely, Tharion replied, his tone rough but his hands surprisingly careful as he removed the frozen rag from her mouth. Who did this to you? Vaelinne tried to answer, but her jaw refused to cooperate. All that escaped was a weak whimper. Something in her eyes, rage, shame, defiance must have shown, because the Duke's expression shifted with the faintest glint of respect. Don't try to talk. Conserve your strength. The healer arrived quickly, a young man who checked her pulse and declared hypothermia. We need to warm her carefully. Too fast and her heart could stop. Tharion didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion he scooped her from the snow, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. The sudden warmth of his body was almost painful, but she instinctively pressed closer, animal need overriding pride. We ride for Ironholt, he commanded. Double time. When someone worried she might not survive the journey, Theon's reply was simple and fierce. I didn't dig her out of the snow just to watch her die. The ride blurred into pain and half-dreams. Hooves thundering, Theon's iron-strong arms holding her steady against the wind, her mind drifting between the sack, her father's study, and her cousin Gareth's smiling betrayal. At one point she shivered violently. Good, Tharion said above her. Shivering means your body is still fighting. Keep fighting. She wanted to tell him she had been fighting her whole life for recognition, for value beyond being a pawn in her family's games, but darkness pulled her under again. She woke next to the sensation of being carried up stone steps. Torchlight flickered on ancient walls. Voices echoed, found in the Blackwood nearly frozen. The Duke himself brought her. Theon's voice cut through like a blade, ordering hot water, blankets, and Mistress Carrig immediately. When someone questioned the wisdom, he snapped, Do I pay you to think or to follow orders? She was laid on a soft bed in the West Tower guest chamber, the luxury overwhelming after the burlap prison. The Duke stood beside her, still in his travel-stained cloak, watching with those winter-sharp eyes. You're safe now, he said, not as comfort but as absolute fact. No one touches what's under my protection. Remember that. Exhaustion finally claimed her. As she slipped away, she thought she saw the ghost of a different man flicker across his scarred face, someone he might have been before the world turned him to iron. For the first time in days, she didn't dream of cold or betrayal. She dreamed of steel. When Vaelinne woke again, warmth surrounded her, and the distant smell of baking bread filled the air. For one perfect moment she thought she was back in her childhood bedroom at Morroway Keep. Then memory crashed down. She sat up too quickly, head swimming, body aching with deep bone weariness. A middle-aged woman in healer's robes introduced herself as Mistress Carrig. You've been asleep nearly 2 days. Your body needs time. Vaelinne took stock, fingers and toes responding, no numbness, just profound tiredness. She was alive against impossible odds. Carrig explained she was in Ironholt, in chambers reserved for honored guests. The Duke had ordered she receive everything needed for recovery. Vaelinne almost laughed at the absurdity. She was a discarded problem her family had tried to erase with rope and winter. What could the ruthless Iron Duke possibly want with her? Still, she asked to see him, to thank him and explain why she had been left in the Blackwood. Carrig simply said the Duke acted because someone needed help, that was his way. After the healer left, Vaelinne dressed in the simple wool gown left for her and looked out the narrow window. Ironholt perched on a cliff like a bird of prey, dark stone in sharp angles built to defy siege and storm. Below lay snow-covered valleys and distant villages, behind rose the jagged Iron Spine Mountains. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, much like its master. The distance from her cousins should have brought comfort, but instead it stirred a new fear. She was alone in the domain of a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary. The door opened and the Duke himself filled the frame. In daylight he looked no less intimidating, tall, solid, sword at his hip, scar prominent. You're awake. Good. We need to talk. Vaelinne straightened, drawing on every lesson in dignity she possessed. She owed him her life and said so. Tharion didn't want her life, he wanted answers. Why had a noblewoman been tied in a sack and left to freeze? When she explained her cousin's greed for the Morroway seal and lands, and warned they would come looking, Theon's reply was flat and certain, let them come. They'll find Ironholt less accommodating than the Blackwood. He made it clear he feared nothing, not greedy relatives, not their influence. Looking at him, Vaelinne realized he truly didn't. That made him either her greatest salvation or the most dangerous man she had ever met. The first week passed in recovery and quiet observation. Vaelinne had learned early that survival meant understanding the spaces and people around her. As her strength slowly returned, she watched the rhythms of the fortress. The Duke was everywhere and nowhere, sparring at dawn until his men were exhausted while he barely broke a sweat, dispensing justice in the great hall with brutal efficiency, riding out on patrols that sometimes returned with blood on his sword. Yet there were cracks in the legend of the Iron Duke that surprised her. On her fourth day, during a short walk, she heard children's laughter from an open doorway. Peering in, she saw a makeshift schoolroom filled with orphans and servant children. And there at the front, pointing to letters on a slate board, was Duke Tharion Bellgrave himself, his granite voice softened with patience as he helped a small girl sound out words. He actually smiled a small, genuine quirk of his scarred mouth when she succeeded. Vaelinne slipped away unseen, mind reeling. The man who showed no mercy on the battlefield taught orphans to read. She noticed more after that. He served himself last at meals so his people ate first. Servants met his eyes without fear. One afternoon in the stables she watched him carefully bandaging a stable boy's injured dog, his large hands gentle, instructing the child with calm kindness. When he noticed her watching, a flicker of something like embarrassment crossed his face, as if kindness was a secret weakness to hide. When she asked why he worked so hard to seem made of stone, he answered quietly, "Because stone doesn't break. Stone doesn't bleed. Stone doesn't make the mistake of trusting the wrong person." There was a story there, the buried betrothed, the betrayal that had forged him into a fortress. The shutters came down over his eyes before she could ask more. On the 10th day he summoned her to his study, a room of maps, books, and functional austerity warmed by a roaring fire. He had received inquiries about her disappearance from her cousins, a magistrate, and most dangerously, Lord Severn Wraith, a powerful southern lord with ambitions and interest in reopening an ancient, dangerous trade route called the Serpent's Run that crossed Morroway lands. The pieces clicked into place. Her cousins wanted the seal and passage rights to strike a deal with Wraith. When she refused to sign anything, they tried to eliminate her. Tharion had refused Wraith's earlier offers to override the deed, holding firm to law and honor. Tharion suggested she stay dead a little longer to buy time to gather evidence while her brother remained safer under the illusion she was gone. Vaelinne realized the cold logic was right. So she became a ghost learning to fight back. Dawn training sessions in the yard began her first attempts with the practice sword clumsy and ridiculous. Tharion was relentless but fair, knocking her weapon aside again and again, declaring her dead until she learned to stop overthinking and trust instinct. One morning he caught her when she slipped on ice, pulling her against his chest. For a heartbeat the world narrowed to the solid strength of his arm, the steady beat of his heart, the scent of steel and winter air. Something shifted between them in that moment, a crack in his iron mask, a spark neither could quite name. Weeks passed. Tension grew in the great hall one evening. Vaelinne's instincts, sharpened by survival, screamed warning when a serving girl's nervous glance and the seneschal Seward's unusual silence stood out. When Tharion reached for his wine, she stopped him. Despite the risk of embarrassment, she insisted someone test it. The seneschal's protests crumbled when a rat died convulsing from the poisoned cup. Betrayal was exposed. Seward had been selling information and plotting with Wraith. In the chaos, Vaelinne's quick thinking saved the Duke's life. Afterward, gratitude and something deeper passed between them. For the first time he asked her to call him Tharion when they were alone. Allies had become something more. 3 days later her cousins arrived with banners and demands, expecting an easy confrontation. In the great hall, Tharion refused to rise, treating them as petitioners. When they tried lies and legal claims, Vaelinne stood beside him and faced them with steady courage, declaring she was there by choice, under the Duke's protection. Tharion made it clear any threat to her would be their last mistake. Her cousins retreated, but the battle wasn't over. They returned stronger, with Lord Wraith himself and magistrates, including one bearing the king's seal. Accusations flew, but Vaelinne and Tharion had prepared. She presented evidence: a hunter's statement, financial records linking Wraith to her cousins, correspondence proving the conspiracy, and her father's original will certified by the Archivist Guild showing forgery. The case was overwhelming. Charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder landed. When Wraith and her cousins resisted, Theon's guards moved in. Gareth lunged at her in desperation, only to be stopped by the Duke's fist. Justice was served. The conspirators were taken to the dungeons pending trial. Months later, spring finally touched the northern mountains. The trial in the capital ended in guilty verdicts. The seal was recovered exactly where Vaelinne had hidden the combination in her memory. Her young brother was safe with family in the south. Vaelinne had her name, her lands, and her freedom restored. Yet as she packed in her tower room, the thought of leaving Ironholt felt wrong. Mistress Carrick gently challenged her fears, reminding her how the Duke had changed since she arrived, smiling genuinely, showing warmth he had buried for years. Looking down from the window, Vaelinne saw Tharion surrounded by the fortress children, patiently teaching them sword forms, dirt on his cheek, hair tousled, completely at ease in gentle chaos. Her heart opened fully. She found him in the stables, brushing his warhorse, and finally spoke the truth. She didn't want to leave. This place, these people, this man, they felt like home. She wanted to stay because she chose him, because when she imagined her future, he was in it. She loved him. Tharion kissed her fiercely, pouring months of restrained longing into it. When they broke apart, he admitted he had been ready to let her go out of a misguided sense of nobility, but he didn't want to be noble. He wanted everything with her: a future, partnership, family, growing old, arguing strategy and philosophy. He wanted to teach their children to read and fight and think for themselves. Vaelinne said yes to all of it. She loved him, had started falling the moment he heard her desperate whisper for help, and decided she was worth saving. Right there in the stable, he dropped to one knee and gave her a proper proposal, heartfelt, sincere, asking her to be his duchess, his equal, his partner, not out of gratitude but choice. She said yes, tears in her eyes. They kissed again, laughing with relief and joy. The Iron Duke and the woman who had melted his frozen heart had found each other in the most unlikely way. That evening he announced their betrothal to the household. Cheers erupted. Children hugged her legs, demanding she stay forever. She promised she wasn't going anywhere. Later, in the tower, wrapped in his arms, they looked out at the mountains that had witnessed their beginning. The voice that had once whispered "help me" in darkness had found its answer. The girl abandoned to die had become a woman who fought, trusted, and loved without fear. She had chosen her own future, and it was more beautiful than any destiny forced upon her. My beautiful family, if you made it all the way to the end, you're clearly my people. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Thousands of you will watch this entire story, feel all the emotions, and then just scroll away without leaving a like or sharing it. Meanwhile, someone in your life, your friend, your mom, your book club, is desperately searching for a story exactly like this and has no idea it exists. It takes 2 seconds to share this video and make their day. And if you don't subscribe right now, YouTube will literally never show you my next story. Subscribe and never miss another epic romance. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. Subscribe to my channel.